group sessions. The first of the plenary lectures by Professor Jacqueline Bhabha, moving beyond them and us to a new we, the challenge of migrant solidarity, will begin in just a moment. Then at 2:30 p.m., there will be a workshop for students. Can we solve the migration crisis 7 years later? Also led by Professor Jacqueline Bhabha and moderated by PhD Urszula Markowska-Manista. And the workshop will take place in our relax zone, so just right here downstairs. We invite all of you cordially. I'm looking at my classmates. I hope to see them there today. The third main event at 5 p.m., it's a debate on migration, opportunities and challenges, with the participation of Professor Maciej Duszczyk from University of Warsaw and Draginia Nadazdin, General Director of Doctors Without Borders in Poland. And the moderator of our debate will be our Vice Dean of the Faculty of Modern Languages, Professor Monika Kostro. The debate will take place here at room 0410. So I hope to see you all there, all here. And furthermore, today we cordially invite you to our official Congress dinner at 7 p.m. here in the Australian Garden, so upstairs, right there where there is a coffee right now. I wish all of us a good, productive day, and thank you very much. Now I will invite our chair for this lecture, PhD Urszula Markowska. I'm sorry, I'm just making mistakes.
No problem. Good morning. As I see, it's 9:40 a.m. and it's perfect time to start the day. So let's begin. And dear scholars, dear professors, dear guests, dear students, dear PhD candidates, and all of you who are listening and watching us online, it's my great honor, privilege, and at the same time pleasure to welcome you all to the second plenary lecture of the Congress. I have a difficult task and at the same time extremely pleasant task to briefly introduce our wonderful guest, keynote speaker, Professor Jacqueline Bhabha, who is visiting Poland for the first time and since yesterday in Warsaw. She's known by everyone who deals in academia, and not only in academia, with human rights in migration and refugee processes. Professor Jacqueline Bhabha is a professor of the practice of health and human rights at the Harvard T. Chan School of Public Health, the Jeremiah Smith Jr. Lecturer in Law at Harvard Law School, and an adjunct lecturer in public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. She is also the director of research at the Harvard VXB Center for Health and Human Rights. From 1997 to 2001, Professor Bhabha directed the Human Rights Program at the University of Chicago. Before 1997, she was a practicing human rights lawyer in London at the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg. She has published extensively on issues of transnational migration, especially child migration, refugee protection, children's rights, and citizenship. And she is the author of Child Migration and Human Rights in a Global Age, and my favorite book, Can We Solve the Migration Crisis? And Bhabha was the founding chair of the Scholars at Risk Network, and she serves on the board of the World Peace Foundation, the Institute of Stateliness and Inclusion, Fortify Rights, the Journal of Refugee Studies, and the Journal of Migration and Human Security. Her current research focuses on adolescents at risk of violence, social exclusion, and discrimination. And her latest research project, Building Inclusion, Sustaining Solidarity, Frontline Host Communities, Distressed Migrants, and the Role of States, also concern us, because in Poland, we are on the front line of building solidarity and the lack of it. This is not the end of Professor Jacqueline Bhabha's impressive and at the same time extremely important achievements for social change, but let me leave the floor to Professor Jacqueline Bhabha. So, Jacqueline, the floor is yours.
Good morning. Thank you very much to Dr. Markowska-Monista for that wonderfully generous and kind introduction. And thank you that's better. Does that work? Okay. And thank you also very much to the University of Warsaw and many of the people who work in the university for the very, very generous and supportive welcome that my husband and I have received coming to Poland for the first time. It's really an exciting and moving trip for us to come to somewhere which has such a profoundly important place in the history of Europe, the history of the world, and for somebody who studies conflict and refugee protection, of course, few countries have had the exposure to both conflict and the imperative of refugee protection. Few countries have had as much of that, I would say, as Poland. So I'm really delighted to share some of my recent ideas and work with you. And I should say that this is very much a work in progress. So criticism and suggestions and comments will be extremely welcome. So as you know, the title of this talk is called Moving Beyond Them and Us to a New We, the Challenge of Migrant Solidarity. So I think I'm going to start right here where we are in Poland. According to the Polish Economic Institute, 77% of Poles took part in efforts to help fleeing Ukrainians in the early months of the war. 77%. This presentation that I'm about to make is about the urgent challenge of sustaining over time the solidarity of local people towards distressed migrants who arrive and come to live in their communities. This is a challenge that I imagine is self-evident and likely highly salient for many of you in Poland since February 24th, 2022, the date, as we all know, when Russia invaded Ukraine and millions of civilians were forced to flee their homes and seek shelter in neighboring countries, 7.8 million of them at least in Poland. As recently as a month ago, on November the 15th, 2022, it was reported that 20,000 Ukrainians a day are entering and arriving in Poland. 1.5 million have registered for temporary protection and enjoy untrammeled border crossing thanks to the EU's Temporary Protection Directive, which, again, as I'm sure many of you know, was activated for the very first time ever to address this humanitarian emergency. So in Poland today, the urgency of sustaining solidarity with distressed migrants is not an abstract principle, but a daily and pressing reality. But sustaining solidarity with distressed migrants has been a global challenge for much longer, and it will remain a challenge into the future. I'll suggest in this short presentation that this challenge is one of the central human rights issues of our time. It affects millions of distressed migrants and millions of local people living with them in transformed frontline communities struggling against all sorts of odds to move from them and us to a new we. By way of clarification, let me say at the outset that I'm using the term distress migrants advisedly. I understand this term to cover people forced to leave their home because of intolerable circumstances beyond their control. So I use the term because it covers both refugees, quotes, refugees who fall within the international protection scheme established under the UN Convention on the Status of Refugees in 1951, but it also covers other migrants, those fleeing conflict, disaster, climate change, and other unbearable situations which do not fall within the relatively narrow legal definition of a refugee. So Ukrainians fleeing to Poland because of the prospect of Russian attacks, Venezuelans fleeing to Colombia because of economic calamity, Bangladeshis forced to leave their homes because of massive flooding or other environmental disasters are all within my concept, distress migrants, even though many of them do not qualify as refugees stricto sensu. Migration advocates and experts have long been aware that migration policies have direct and dramatic impacts on distressed migrants, and that those impacts need to be the focus of our work. And indeed, I'm sure many of you in the audience, like myself, have spent years working on the ways in which law and state policy impact migrants. As practitioners representing migrants who are denied protection, education, or healthcare, as policymakers crafting laws to protect distressed migrants from detention or family separation, and as advocates calling for changes to oppressive, exclusionary immigration measures, including interception at sea, militarized border controls, and punishing visa policies. But migration policies also affect the frontline local communities that migrants depend on, at the border, within the main cities, and in small towns across the country. Classrooms are front lines, health clinics are front lines, border villages are front lines, all of them spaces where the lives of local communities are affected by unplanned, large-scale distress migration. In short, while extensive critical, political, and scholarly attention has been paid to the often brutal impact of migration systems on distressed migrants before, during, and after their journeys, and to the outdated and dysfunctional legal frameworks governing those systems, much less scrutiny has been directed at the system's impact on local frontline communities. I'd like to suggest that this significant shortcoming needs to be rectified for at least two reasons. First, the attitudes and experiences of frontline communities are a critical element in ensuring or preventing a welcoming and humanizing experience for distressed migrants at a crucial, often particularly stressful inflection point in their journey. Many of you in this audience will be only too well aware of this. For people fleeing brutal bombings of their homes, to be met by barbed wire and rabid, hate-spewing crowds on the other side of the fence is, of course, a radically different experience to being met by a long line of strollers gifted for those who need them, to be met by flowers and water bottles, by hugs and posters with loving messages, by social media covered in yellow and blue, as one of the interviewees from the research project that I'm conducting with Polish colleagues, including Dr. Markowska-Menista, put it. This idea of having the whole social media flooded with blue and yellow. What a wonderful, welcoming gesture. Each of these memories remain seared in the memory of those arriving. Sorry, each of these experiences remain seared in the memories of those arriving, likely for a lifetime. The experience of Ukrainians in Poland, therefore, stands in sharp contrast to that of the much smaller number of Syrians and Afghan distressed migrants who the Polish government refused to offer protection to in 2015 and following. So that's the first reason why I think it's imperative to attend to the needs and interests of frontline communities, to sustain a generous rather than a hateful response. But there's a second reason why attending to local community needs is critically important. The actions and attitudes of these frontline communities towards distressed migrants and their needs have the potential to be a key force driving national and regional policies. Just lost my place. And either sustaining or challenging exclusionary migration politics. If effective communities of solidarity can be created and sustained, the aftermath of distressed migration can generate win-win outcomes, enriching local settings in unexpected ways. But as long as government policies fail to generate the requisite organized, preemptive humanitarian support for populations forced to flee their homes, solidarity will dissipate, and this outcome can be politically and socially impactful for years to come. Already in Poland, less than a year from the start of the arrivals, and as the war grinds on, there are some signs, and I quote from a recent article, of fatigue and in some quarters even anger, articulated by an aggressive and vocal minority. This is a signal that carefully managed and tailored government and EU engagement in support of local community solidarity is absolutely critical. Though the Polish government, with substantial EU support, has already spent the equivalent of $8 billion on social services for Ukrainians, by far the highest expenditure in Europe, aided by volunteers and local government actors, some argue that enthusiasm for those actions is slowing down, particularly as inflation at 18% and economic challenges play into the fear-mongering of far-right actors. So I think our first takeaway then is that local communities directly implicated in contemporary migration situations have, with the requisite state support, the potential to impact and transform the broader national conscience of which they're part. Their empathic solidarity towards migrants can translate into vocal political support for humane and receptive national policies for refugees and others fleeing harm, and for the promotion of inclusive integration policies in schools, in hospitals, in workplaces, in training centers, in civic organizations, and so on. Members of local communities engaged in this sort of inclusive response to the needs of new arrivals can speak or tweet from their own first-hand experience, citing anecdotes and examples that give authority to their opinions and that generate and animate a broader polity. As one of the informants in the research that we're doing here in Poland said, quote, "Helping the Ukrainians was a beautiful thing, and it dispelled the myth that we are selfish, that we don't want to help, that we are xenophobic." But the opposition of frontline locals, a foreseeable outcome of inadequate infrastructure support for new circumstances that undermines local people's standard of living, can easily fuel xenophobic and exclusionary policies at the border. Again, to quote from our research, if there is a shortage of money, sausage, sugar, and so on, then one's always looking for a scapegoat, and this solidarity can easily break. So the border, at the frontier, in the classroom, in the supermarket, in the hospital emergency room, matters. It matters not only as a site where state sovereignty is enacted, but where local solidarity or rejection radiates out to a broader political constituency. State policies that anticipate and strengthen the empathic capacities of border communities foster these generative outcomes. So the activation of the European Union's Temporary Protection Directive is an outstanding and unique example of this sort of anticipatory state policy, an example without any recent precedent. Where islanders in Lesbos and Chios, villagers in Cox's Bazar, Bangladesh, and in Matamoros, Mexico, have felt the consequences of a disproportionate shouldering of responsibility and a stunning lack of external solidarity, local communities transformed by the large-scale arrival of Ukrainian distressed migrants have so far encountered sustained preemptive regional and national policy initiatives that incentivize and reward solidarity. A natural experiment, you might say, in empathic solidarity seems, for the first time, to be unfolding in front of our eyes, though of course it's too early to anticipate how it will play out over time. But to look at what we already know from recent decades of state engagement with distressed migration prior to the current Ukrainian war, it's abundantly clear that much current policy contributes to the destruction rather than the enhancement of local empathic solidarity, with evident and profound political spin-offs. So I use this term empathic solidarity to refer to the empathy-fueled practical engagement with an other to whom one is not bound by prior links of personal or social affinity. The capacity and the desire to express solidarity, to constitute oneself as an ethical actor, is evident across the globe where forced migrants interface with frontline communities. But solidarity, of course, is not self-sustaining. It can be exhausted. Protracted migrant sojourns without the requisite state support vitiate that empathic response. Current policies generate transformations in feeling and thinking in host communities that we need to understand better. And it is this aspect of migration policy at the frontline community level which I think we have neglected and we really need to pay more attention to. So in my view, empathic solidarity is more important than ever as a democratic resource. With the notable exception of the situation here in Ukraine, gone are the days when most international forced migration occurred across well-charted and predictable routes. For example, as used to be the case from Iran via Paris to Los Angeles, from Sri Lanka via Rome to London, from Chile or Argentina to Spain, the UK or Scandinavia. Routes in those days that connected officially designated border crossing points staffed by trained immigration officials. The growing technological sophistication of migration control today has rendered access to legal and safe mobility increasingly elusive for millions of forced migrants. And this is not unintentional, of course, it's an intentional result that allocates mobility along lines of privilege and power. The result is that travel itineraries by those who are excluded from preferential access, those itineraries have evolved to evade state-crafted obstacles en route. These migrations, of course, are very different from the seamless mobility of the privileged. And for the moment, we can say that Ukrainians are amongst the privileged because they have a sort of seamless border crossing. But most people do not. And they're different from the structured humanitarian corridors, community sponsorship and resettlement programs that over decades have enabled a minority of distressed migrants to safely leave danger. So prior to the exodus from Ukraine, people fleeing war, violence, climate-related disasters, and other threats to their lives have, as the refugees from Syria demonstrated so clearly, routinely lacked any official humanitarian assistance and instead have been forced to resort to improvised itineraries which not only expose them to serious, even life-threatening risk, but also bring them face to face with frontline local populations ill-equipped to receive and sustain them. And yet, despite their lack of preparation, time and again, these frontline hosts have risen to the humanitarian challenge, displaying remarkable material generosity and openness of spirit, despite disruption of their quotidian routine and lack of institutional support. So this pervasive aspect of frontline behavior, empathic solidarity, is critical and fragile. And we need to examine both these factors to understand how we can do better. Because empathic solidarity, its presence, its destruction, its sustenance has not been the focus of migration scholars, my use of the term, I think, requires some clarification. So I understand solidarity generally to refer to a politically driven engagement with an other towards whom different forms of support might be extended. Emotional support, material support, strategic or broadly political support. Classic examples of solidarity, and those of you like myself who are somewhat older will remember, are boycotts of products. In the old days, none of us ate Granny Smiths from South Africa, for example, or Californian grapes, and people avoid buying blood diamonds, so-called. So these are examples of solidarity to avoid goods associated with exploitation and injustice. A political response more than an emotional reaction. And I think a lot of humanitarian work is driven by this motivation, be it the act of first responders to disasters or the financial contributions that fuel those interventions. Those exhibiting solidarity often have no personal or direct link to the situations they engage with. They're driven by political or ideological triggers that activate their behavior, often accompanied by an intention to challenge a particular power hierarchy. So the term empathic solidarity, as I understand it, specifies the term solidarity by suggesting the process, empathy, through which the response of solidarity towards outsiders arriving in one's community is generated. Though related, I think it can be distinguished from the political or ideological solidarity I just mentioned. Humanists interested in the processes that link thinking to feeling and that drive changes in both, identify empathy as a quintessentially human trigger of behavior. Evolutionary biologists exploring how a selfish primate like the human might be motivated to engage with others' interests have shown that the human inclination to offer help to people outside the immediate family network has developed over evolutionary history as a genetic heritage that is naturally selected, an altruism gene, as it were, that stimulates reciprocal altruism or likelihood of a payback down the line. The scholar Michael McCullough, for example, argues that the principle of Darwinian survival of the fittest has become modified over time, replaced by what has been now called Darwin Plus, to support the evolution of ethical capabilities. So another way of putting this point is to say that moral, rather than selfish behavior towards others, enables human beings to reap the benefits of cooperation. Neuroscientists who study the physiological underpinnings of empathy have shown that different parts of the brain are activated when people or animals feel empathy for others, and that this empathic capacity has both emotional and cognitive parts. So vicarious observations of somebody else's pain can elicit activation of shared neuronal networks in the person directly experiencing and the person witnessing the pain. These specialized brain cells are referred to as mirror neurons, mirroring between the sufferer and the empathizer, if you like. And the capacity to know what's happening to others has been called shared mind intelligence. From a social science vantage point, one can suggest that building on these scientific insights, a form of outreach and engagement with the other is driven by some degree of empathy, experiencing their feelings as one's own, with their needs, and even a cognitive acceptance of the legitimacy of their claim for enforcement of rights. So I think these concepts, these scientific concepts, are useful for us as social justice activists, or whatever we want to call ourselves, in thinking about what motivates people to reach out initially. I would like to distinguish empathic solidarity from some other terms that are widely used, such as sympathy and charity, both of which, of course, are important and valuable at different times. Sympathy, as I understand it, suggests an expression of emotion directed at acknowledging rather than addressing human suffering, feeling for rather than feeling with. And it's not in and of itself a dynamic process. According to some scholars, compassion has a similar meaning. So there's a whole literature on compassion and sympathy, which is important, but I'm trying to distinguish what I'm talking about from that. Similarly, charity may be the outcome of a pro-social norm, a religious or ethical duty encouraged by a person's cultural environment, a form of behavior that elicits a so-called warm glow feeling that's socially valued and rewarded. Social scientists have found economic correlates typically associated with inequality, income inequality, for example, to be positively associated with the likelihood of charitable activity. So charity is often, not always, but often related to a place of socio-economic superiority or a sense of obligation, however well-intentioned. In a recent essay, the magnificent writer Jenny Erpenbeck provides a vivid example of this sort of charity. And if you'll allow me to, I'd like to just briefly quote a section from a recent essay. She recalls a scene she experienced shortly after German reunification as a young East Berliner whose country and whose past had just, in effect, disappeared. And I quote, "In the dark of a December evening, a truck with a West Berlin license plate was parked on a muddy lot near the border crossing. From the tailgate of the truck, a West German, apparently the owner of a paper store, was handing out Christmas-themed wrapping paper to us East Germans, so that we, the needy people who didn't have such lovely, shiny wrapping paper, could have a chance to enjoy something pretty for a change. I'm sure he meant well. For me, his gesture as he handed down those rolls of paper from the tailgate embodied the whole misery of our inequality. It was a gesture of objective arrogance. Most of all, it carried the message, I am above and you are below. I'm the one who can afford to give gifts." Whatever the donor's intention, I think charity is often marked by this sort of objective arrogance. In her analysis of the difference between the American and the French revolutions, Hannah Arendt argued that French revolutionaries' attitude of compassion for the poor positioned them, the poor, as less than citizens, people excluded from the effective political membership by leaders who claimed to speak for them. Pity, she argued, and I'm quoting, may be the perversion of compassion. Its alternative is solidarity. It is out of pity that men are attracted to les hommes faibles, but it is out of solidarity that they establish a community of interest with the oppressed. Charity, in her view, then, has corrosive effects. Solidarity, by contrast, is enabling and equalizing. Interestingly, social scientists report an inverse relationship between power and empathy. Whereas the position of power is positively associated with charity, it is negatively associated with the more horizontal outreach and giving associated with empathic acts. One could take this a step further. Whereas empathic solidarity implicates people acting in their own environments towards proximate outsiders, charity often promotes distancing. Indeed, at a time of growing questioning about widespread processes of migrant exclusion, philanthropic engagements are attracting heightened scrutiny because of implicit, sometimes hidden agendas, particularly in the development context where a colonial or a post-colonial legacy colors the meaning of a gift or a charitable project. Lauren Landau and Irian Fremantle refer to the linkage of development aid, they are talking particularly in the context of Africa, development aid linked with migration control, the so-called migration development nexus. They refer to it as containment development, a paternalistic set of policies designed to protect people desperate to leave from the hazards of the migration journey by investing in local economies. These policies, they argue, produce a trap, a regulatory regime that intercepts and prevents mobility while coding even the most coercive means used as necessary to, quote, protect Africans. They argue that despite clear evidence that development investments increase rather than decrease mobility, Western donors such as the EU continue in many cases to promote the notion that development aid is essential so that sedentarism should be the default, mobility the exception. So I think this is very relevant to our conversation about empathic solidarity. This dynamic of paying to exclude is particularly evident where charitable interventions are what's called NIMBY in their intent. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that term, NIMBY. Let's give help, but not in my backyard. N-I-M-B-Y, NIMBY, not in my backyard. Give help, but somewhere else, so that it's not going to impinge on my life. Humanitarian investments to ensure that refugees, however, due to their circumstances, stay relatively out of sight of Western wealth and communities in countries neighboring their own, captured by the treacherous and overworked phrase, "do not come," which Kamala Harris famously said on her first trip to Central America, they can have this NIMBY flavor. So can programs couched as well-intentioned and charitable, cynically designed to protect distressed migrants from evil traffickers and smugglers by actually blocking their access to potential points of departure. So as I'm trying to develop the notion, the social space prone to empathic responses and amenable to solidarity can be made more elastic and expansive than one might at first have anticipated. A quote again from the research that Ursula and I are involved in maybe illustrates this point nicely. And I'm quoting from someone who works with the Polish Committee for Defense of Democracy, who told us about a very large Afghan family that had ended up in Gdynia. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, Gdynia. And this is the quote: "If it hadn't been for our very quick and specific action, I don't know if this family would have had to live in some night shelter or even on the street. But within a week, we arranged an apartment for them, full furnishings, all the equipment, and to this day, we are still in contact. That was about 1.5 years ago. It's not enough to get to know each other through work, because that's not enough to break down barriers. It's important that people talk to each other, help each other, and get to know each other in a more concrete way, that they also get to know each other's culture. And then, of course, for example, through culinary events. The Afghan family invited us for dinner several times. In such situations, it's easier to see a person rather than just a person who has a different complexion. But it really takes a lot from both sides, because it's very easy to withdraw, both in the case of the stranger or the other and in the case of this host. So I think this is really an important point. This indifference is perhaps even worse, how to break it. Here the state, this is the quote from the informant that we spoke to, here the state is doing too little, as it seems to have now thrown itself quickly into humanitarian aid to Ukraine, but it's doing absolutely nothing to integrate Ukrainians in a more effective way. If there was no integration center in Gdansk, for example, which was established with the money of the local government, there would be no such initiatives at all. So I think that this notion of empathetic solidarity that I'm trying to develop is critical, and it's a foundation for thinking about how we sustain a better future. But it contrasts sharply with other notions of solidarity that have recently been deployed in the migration context. In particular, the recent EU Pact on Migration and Asylum, which some of you will be familiar with, utilizes the notion of interstate solidarity and flexible solidarity, and even the oxymoronic mandatory flexible solidarity, to describe conduct expected of EU member states in relation to the management of external migration. So they use the term solidarity in a way that, to my mind, has nothing to do with empathic solidarity and everything to do with acquiescing to anti-migrant politics. In this application of the term, solidarity is the deployment of member state resources to support in-group against out-group members, to protect the them and us divide. How? By funding forced return of unsuccessful asylum seekers. So the solidarity, so-called solidarity fund, is a fund to deport or to return people. And the solidarity is with other EU member states who don't want those failed asylum seekers. Nothing to do with the sort of solidarity I'm talking about. These acts of solidarity, in quotes, are euphemistically referred to as the support of return sponsorships, which is kind of sweet talk, I would say, for deportation de facto. The pact undermines an earlier decision of the European Court of Justice that found Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic's refusals to implement their refugee relocation obligations violations of their solidarity responsibilities, which to my mind is a more rational use of the term solidarity. So my concern in focusing on empathic solidarity is primarily to advance a case for attending to this significant phenomenon replicated the world over that has dramatic and neglected implications for migration policy. The common, and what is this, this phenomenon? The common attitudinal shift, what the social scientist Sherry Turkle might call the change in thinking and feeling among frontline local communities who are exposed to two phenomena concurrently. On the one hand, they're exposed to the suffering of unknown distressed migrants forced to leave their homes, who eventually arrive on their doorsteps, unannounced and unexpected. And on the other hand, there is a pervasive government failure to which results in unduly and willfully burdening these same frontline communities with protractive spin-offs from these spontaneous arrivals, spin-offs that may well in fact affect the local community's daily life adversely. This governance failure seeps into local communities' lives in both predictable and unpredictable ways. For example, producing overcrowded public facilities, displays of destitution and desperation, resentment, and occasionally acts of aggression intended for, maybe deserved by distant policymakers, but often meted out onto locals. So the attitudinal and behavioral shift consists of a move from a welcoming, generous, and open-armed reception to a hostile, exclusionary, and resentful rejection of migrants' presence and needs. The local communities in question, where this change of heart and mind manifests itself, are not, of course, the professional humanitarians or the human rights advocates of one sort or another, social workers, lawyers, researchers, emergency physicians, journalists, etc., whose paid life work it is to engage with unknown strangers. Nor are they the self-proclaimed human rights activists who regularly place demands on governments. The constituencies who engage in these acts of rescue and support, despite official threats, are well described by the legal scholar Itamar Mann as, quotes, those of us who define ourselves through our commitment to human rights. Advocates who are driven by a law that requires us to regard all human beings as if they enjoyed some necessary protections. But this is not the constituency relevant to the discussion. Rather, it's the local communities in question who inhabit the spaces that, because of the intersection of exclusion policies and geographical contingency, become hotspots for distressed migrants. What these communities exhibit is not the special commitment of a few or the paid human rights activists I mentioned before, but initially that near universal human trait that I mentioned earlier. And in fact, if you look across the globe in frontline communities, you find many local people becoming engaged in unanticipated, transformative acts of empathic solidarity towards the strangers presenting themselves uninvited on arrival. So this type of empathic solidarity is not driven by a sense of duty or legal obligation or superior power. When empathy leads to acts of solidarity, when recognizing someone's humanity leads to sharing one's own food or clothing with them, overcoming one's reticence or one's suspicion or maybe one's fear of the stranger, sacrificing time, energy, and other resources for the stranger's benefit with no ulterior motive, then one is engaged in what I'm trying to call empathic solidarity. So this is a form of grassroots engagement with another, a fellow human being, that is unexpected and powerful. The other is a non-member of the receiving community, whether the community is defined by race, religion, citizenship, or other social or identity status. Again, to quote one of our informants from this research that we're doing here in Poland, and I quote, Once I remembered a quote from Mark Edelman: "When you look at evil and you do not do anything, you become responsible. And because it's much easier and much more comfortable to sit in a coffee shop and enjoy your cake, then look how people watch, how people are being shot to death. And I decided I don't want to be the person who sits in the coffee shop. So that was my motivation. You want to make the world better, so you make yourself feel better." Even though histories of colonization, conquest, and extraction can in many contexts be said to generate an ethical and political reparatory obligation of inclusion and oneness, derived from the continuity of the association and interaction across borders, this is a far cry from members of their own community acting towards others. So despite that otherness, the contact to which the local community members are exposed by virtue of non-citizen access can generate powerful opportunities for proximity. Sometimes this contact is thin, very short-term and superficial, a contingent product of an unplanned itinerary, which I've mentioned. Fleeing asylum seekers may pass through a third country en route to their chosen destination in a matter of hours or days. But in reality, because of the vicissitudes of migration control, processing delays, and exclusionary practices, often this time scope is extended. Forced migrants are often in limbo in their extended arrival spots for years rather than hours or days, so that the preconditions, affective and cognitive, for the establishment of a real human empathic connection between local person and new arrival are met. So frontline empathic solidarity sets the stage, I think, for a broader ethic of inclusion and hospitality within our polities. Acts of solidarity instantiate host community support for a politics of exclusion and send a powerful message to policymakers and politicians that if resources are available, they should be shared. But of course, time is of the essence in such situations. Resources need to be replenished in real time. Infrastructure needs to be supported, and solidarity needs to be matched by appropriate policy making in an anticipatory way. Only then, and only in those conditions, I think, can empathic solidarity spur a de facto decolonization of access to international mobility. So frontline solidarity can drive effective policy engagement by supplying the grassroots legitimacy necessary for inclusion. But the process has to be reciprocal. Solidarity on its own can never be self-sustaining. And so the legitimacy of inclusive public policy depends on frontline empathic solidarity pushing that policy. Government policies, I think, have to sustain that stance, preempting, planning, executing inclusive policies that nourish and prolong solidarity, instead, as is now mainly the case, of undermining and destroying the survival of solidarity. So we need to attend to the triggers, psychological, economic, political, that undermine and destroy the feeling of empathic solidarity, triggers that are contingent on policy making and the policy makers' decisions. Neuroscientists and psychologists have devoted considerable attention to the question of brain-based so-called empathy fatigue and its triggers, particularly in the case of large-scale or massive disasters. Social and political scientists, including migration scholars, have considered border exclusion and externalization mechanisms through which access to protection is prevented and empathic solidarity is nullified, including by legitimating pushbacks, punitive detention regimes, and speedy exclusion proceedings. By contrast, we haven't paid enough attention, as I already said, to the social and political process through which local empathic solidarity can be enhanced and solidified. And this, I think, is our urgent task. So, and I'm moving towards the end of my presentation, the complex dynamics that affect successful refugee and immigrant inclusion into host communities have been extensively analyzed, especially in the context of large metropolitan conurbations. Most of this work, however, has focused on the immigrant communities and the extent to which they are integrating, their adaptive capacity, their social mobility, their intergenerational struggles. But now, finally, some recent work, including within the UN system, is looking at the way in which these processes affect local communities, the extent to which local communities are adapted, changing, being inclusive, and changing their own sense of what the we is. In response to a 2018 UN General Assembly resolution calling for an effort to measure the impact of protecting and assisting refugees and asking locals, states to assess gaps in international protection, UNHCR convened a set of important meetings. And these meetings considered the analysis of hosting impacts, but they looked at that mainly as costs rather than benefit. What are the costs to locals of hosting rather than what are the benefits to locals? So I think we need to change that focus. By all means, look at local communities, but not simply in terms of the costs they bear, but the benefits that they might derive from these new situations in which they find themselves. What is known about the attitudes and conduct of non-migrant populations? What is known about the factors that trigger their empathic solidarity? Certainly, it's obvious that very often one has a dramatic volte-face, that you have a dramatic change. But why? What factors cause people to feel and think the way they do? An interesting study by some colleagues in the Netherlands tries to address this question by looking at what they call the non-migrant community. The non-migrant community that in many cities in the Netherlands is now becoming a minority. It starts from the obvious but neglected premise that successful integration and inclusion are two-way processes, and growing numbers of cities are or are rapidly becoming majority-minority, either because no single ethnic population constitutes a majority, or because a group that in the past was an ethnic minority is now becoming a majority. So research conducted into this minority-majority situation in the Dutch city of Rotterdam, for example, demonstrates the key importance of education, and in particular access to higher education as a key element in determining the attitudes and practices towards immigrants of the non-immigrant background community. What the study found was that non-immigrants, they call them non-immigrants, without college education were much more likely to consider immigrants an economic risk and a cultural threat than their university-educated peers, irrespective of economic or class position. I think this is an important finding. So it's not whether you're rich or poor, it's not what job you have, it's whether you have had access to higher education that is determinative of your attitude to the fast-growing majority immigrant population. So my interest is related to this scholarly pivot to the attitudes and conducts of non-migrant community members. To date, work on majority attitudes, mirroring work on migrants and refugees, is concentrated in urban conurbations. Given that most distressed migrants first arrive far from metropolitan centers, we also need to better understand the attitudes of majority populations at the front line, spatially and temporally at the point of arrival. We have done some work in Greece, and it's interesting to see the complexity of attitudes amongst the Greek population. On the one hand, over the decades leading up to 2015, social surveys exploring Europeans' attitudes to immigrants and minorities found that the percentage of Greeks who considered these groups causes of insecurity was higher than that of any other European population. But a different study found that different studies also in the decades leading up to 2015 found that 75% of Greeks opposed cultural and religious diversity. But according to a January 2016 poll, so after the arrival or the beginning of the arrival of large numbers of distressed migrants, about 6 out of 10 Greeks had voluntarily assisted migrants in some way, suggesting a high level of host society empathic solidarity. For distressed migrants to have the opportunity to settle in communities far from their homelands and the possibility of experiencing successful inclusion at some point is usually dependent on overcoming the negative spin-offs on the host communities. So I'm going to just fast forward to my final comments here. So the key players that shape the migrant local community encounter and that have the capacity to replenish or undermine empathic solidarity are both individual and institutional. Both depend on adequate infrastructure and an inclusive meta-narrative that celebrates non-discriminatory access to human rights protections. These features, in turn, depend critically on preemptive and comprehensive engagement with predictable needs of the whole transforming community. So in this framework, local initiatives are critical. A mayor who celebrates her community's generosity and participates on the front line motivates empathic solidarity, just as the heads of a church or a mosque or a synagogue that makes their space available for community needs might do. A political party that preempts local need at a time of large-scale migrant arrival by providing necessary resources for new arrivals and for locals reinforces, encourages, and strengthens locals' capacity for empathic solidarity. A government that invites joint migrant-local engagement in decision-making builds the foundation for collaboration and the expression of pride in common achievements. Social policies that preempt and prevent rapid economic decline in local communities experiencing large-scale migration are key tools for maintaining empathic solidarity. Initiatives that have fostered community sponsorship and hosting programs promote the kind of two-way interaction and speed up this experience of a new belonging that I'm trying to talk about. By contrast, obstructive and callous migration management policies at the front line lead local communities to flip from being open, generous, and enthusiastic about their humanitarian activities to becoming apprehensive, resentful, or explicitly hostile and hate-filled. They also generate costly externalities in terms of militarization of borders, of seaways, of contiguous territorial spaces that trigger domestic tensions and insecurities. So we have to figure out how to avoid this. We have to figure out how to turn global north migration policies away from the 20th century models of limited refugee protection and just post-colonial labor schemes to a much broader inclusion. We must move on from a contemporary migration system where the politics of exhaustion dominate and move instead to one where empathic solidarity is the norm. Thank you.
Dear Professor Jacqueline Bhabha, thank you very much for your very important plenary lecture, and especially important today, important for us. Thanks a lot for explaining us and introducing the empathic solidarity as a key term in the context of the frontline solidarity in context of the non-migrant community and society. Thanks a lot for that. It's a very sensitive topic, and we have time and also we have space for discussion, for questions. Microphones are at our disposal, so you all are welcome to ask the questions.
Thank you, Dr. Bhabha. I'm over here. I am from the U.S. and I actually work in a couple of those frontline communities with migrants from Central America and Mexico. And I really appreciated, I work with my students, I really appreciated your thoughts, and now my head is swimming with new ideas for some of those smaller scale local initiatives, because obviously I work on a much smaller scale than you do. One thing that I was thinking about as you were speaking was you spoke a lot about state initiatives and how the local narrative, flipping the local narrative from negative to positive, can help the state move in a more positive way. I work in both I work in both Missouri and Texas, which are both where the state is extremely conservative, and it'll be a significant challenge to try to flip state policy there. What I wonder is what you think about the possibility of taking advantage of business interests to help provide more resources to celebrate the arrival of those new immigrants, because in my experience in both of those, in McAllen and then in Monette, where I work, it is the local business community that benefits significantly from the influx of new workers. So I wonder if you've thought about that. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. I have thought about that, and I agree with you. I think that, we often call them public-private partnerships, are critical. And there are many examples of those partnerships. There are examples of businesses developing industry, developing employment opportunities, even in refugee camps, let alone within host communities. So I think your point is very well taken. The reason I stress state intervention is because I think that is the starting point. And I think that without that kind of preemptive engagement of states, business engagement is elusive, and it's never going to be reliable. So when it's in the interest of business to recruit workers and to support a particular group of migrants who maybe are viewed positively, then that will happen. And when that motivation changes, or the business moves or ends, then that set of policies will disappear. So I think that it's an important partner. I think, business, religious fora, all sorts of kind of private actors are critical to this process, but the bedrock and the driving force has to be government. And that's, I think, where we've fallen flat, where governments have sort of sat back and sort of said, oh, isn't it terrible how xenophobia seems to be, the norm, it seems to be human nature. And I guess our whole approach is to say there's nothing inevitable about xenophobia. What is inevitable is if you fail to invest, people are not going to be able to sustain their initial solidarity. But I think you're absolutely right. And there's increasing work now saying that in order to move from a kind of more old-fashioned patronizing approach to refugees where you kind of are doing good, you should make it possible for refugees to be self-sustaining. You should make it possible for refugees to actually get jobs as early as possible. And that, I guess, is what's happened with the Temporary Protection Directive, which is such a great example that people are allowed to work. They don't have to, sit there and wait for a handout. So, yeah.
Thank you very much. My mind is also swimming with many thoughts. But just to continue the conversation from our colleague who just spoke, I felt that the demands and the correct demands you put on a state being able to support and extend empathetic solidarity for migrants and refugees at the borders, people who come in to these communities, first response communities. If the governments were to do that for newcomers, then the fact is that those governments don't do it for inequalities that exist among the population. They to put this demand, this kind of virtuous, progressive demand on governments to show their best at that point, when all sorts of other issues, in fact, to go through your questions of access to education, particularly higher education, they don't do it for their population. Equality of treatment, they don't do it. Protection of minorities, long-standing national minorities, they don't do it for that. So why would they suddenly be motivated to do it for people who are coming in? And why would empathy somehow somehow be the lead idea of social transformation when for the stranger, for the other, or whatever you want to call it, when it does not extend to their own population? Why?
Thank you. So I think it's a very important question. I would say a couple of things in response. Firstly, what I'm suggesting is that governments who are engaged already in local situations, if you take, in Warsaw, I mean, there is a government working in local government, central government, EU government engaged in activities in Warsaw. If they had responded to the Ukrainian kind of distress migration by saying, well, Ukrainians are, first of all, they're not allowed to enter, so Ukrainians would be entering illegally. Secondly, they're not allowed to work, so Ukrainians would be working under the table, charging less than local Poles. Thirdly, their children are not allowed to go to local schools, et cetera, et cetera. If that had been the response, which has always been the response to other flows of refugees, you would have a totally different situation amongst local Polish people. Because however generous they might have been right in the beginning, seeing people fleeing, they would start saying, well, these people are taking our jobs, these people are taking our children's places in school, these people are, et cetera, et cetera. So what I'm saying is that it's part of how governments invest in their own communities that needs to change, because their own communities are changing. The whole concept of what is your local community is changing. I mean, you only have to look at Europe as a whole. It's not what Europe was 50 years ago. So if Germany said, we're only going to invest in our notion of a kind of a white Teutonic German, or Swedes, or you name it, they would be undermining the possibilities of their own community's survival, their own community's flourishing. So I think the whole point of this work is to say that them and us, that idea that that a government should not invest in outsiders because it's not doing enough for insiders, is misconceived, because this is all about the insiders too, the insiders' own community. So and how that's being affected. So, if you take the example of Lesbos, where, as you know, I've spent quite a lot of time, there was a remarkable engagement of ordinary local people, poor people, not, human rights activists, ordinary folk, to support people who actually, didn't look or sound or pray like them, Syrians and Afghans primarily, so not the same in a way as the Ukrainian-Polish situation. And because the Greek government was incapable and the European Union could not mobilize the necessary resources, partly because of Eastern European opposition, that kind of wonderful opportunity for really an inclusive process was undermined and was dissipated. So it could have been different with a quarter of the resources that have been made available here. So I think it's not so much a question of well, they're not doing this anyway for their own, so why wouldn't they do that for immigrants? It's a question of saying who are their own and what are their own people facing, and how is the concept of our own changing? So that would be
So just if I understand you correctly,
who's chairing this meeting? Before we get into a long back and forth, I think maybe we should have this in private later on, the next save of this discussion.
I don't discuss these things in private. I only discuss them.
To you.
Thank you very much for introducing again the empathic solidarity. I was just wondering, with out of your studies on the different locations that you've worked with, Is there any age differentiation between the groups that act locally like that? I'm interested in this in terms of calibrating policies, or at least calibrating grassroots movements for kind of generational differences, if there's a way in which education could intervene, perhaps. And I will not ask any questions about how long would it take for state policies to change in that sense. Thinking of the UK example of harvesting the third sector for doing that kind of work and claiming that on the media, at least.
That's really a fascinating point. I don't know of any research that looks at that distinction in age or different generations. The only thing that I can think of is that certainly there's evidence in some of the work that I know our colleagues in the School of Education are doing, that there are different attitudes amongst young people now in very diverse schools towards their peers and towards their in-group, and it's kind of cool to be multicultural in your friends. It's not cool to just hang out only with people who look or sound like you. So there's quite a lot of work on that. So that would be a real distinction even within one generation. But in terms of acts of solidarity, I think from what I know, but this hasn't been studied systematically. There's quite a broad range. If I think of the communities that, if you think of, say the US-Mexico context with the caravans, and I skipped that part of my paper, but, it was very much across the board in Mexico, young and old, all kind of really engaged with people from Central America. Similarly, I think, from what I know, both in Italy and in Greece, the response to distressed migrants has been kind of community-wide. That said, I'm sure when you talk about the longer term of inclusion in kind of daily life and building the new we, I'm sure that I think the kind of drift of your question, which is, people's attitudes to who we are changing, I'm sure that's true, and I'm sure we will find that there's more scope for challenging exclusionary norms. But, if you look at the far right, a lot of the kind of very active, militant, racist activists are also young. So it's not only age, but, I think it's something we need to look at more carefully.
Thank you. Thank you for your very interesting talk. And I really liked how you emphasized that term, distressed migrants rather than refugees. And do you think it's likely that there's going to be a shift in the legal vocabulary to embrace people that are seeking refuge for other than political reasons? Because when we are talking about the legal aspect of this, it's much easier to address those issues with the legal language being transformed.
Thank you. Yes, I think this is, a challenge because, as I'm sure you know, in our kind of legal, human rights space, there are, terminology is key. And so there have been several attempts to move away from the narrow notion of, it's not narrow because millions of people have benefited from the concept of, refugee and refugee protection, but it's now increasingly there's increasingly a mismatch between what that term covers and who needs protection. So people like Alexander Betts, for example, use the concept of survival migrants, and UNHCR themselves have increasingly talked about mixed migration. So, I just use this term because I think that I think survival is too low a bar. I think you should have access to legal mobility, not only to survive, but actually to have a reasonable quality of life. And so I think to say that, they should be allowed to move only if they need to survive is a kind of unacceptable restriction. And I think our refugee framework from the 1951 convention also is unacceptably narrow. But of course, that's what we have. And from a realpolitik perspective, we certainly, I mean, I and none of my peers are arguing that we should be getting rid of the Refugee Convention, because if we did, what we would get would be much worse. So we have to stick with what we have, but we have to try and expand it as much as we can. And so I think this notion of distress migration is useful. And I think those of us who use these terms, and I'm not the only one, are increasingly trying to say that, you know, when we think about climate-related forced migration, which is on everybody's agenda, we have to think of ways in which we can use some of the mechanisms we already have to accommodate need. We can't just reinvent a whole new framework. You know, we're going to have to work within some of what we have. Otherwise, you know, the prospects are going to be very grim.
I believe that in the case of migration, it is essential. I mean, there are two very important factors as regards the attitudes of local people. One is sex, and I'm using the word sex, not gender, in this case, because I believe it is rather sex. And the other one is age. I mean, I think that in Poland, people were very open to this flood of Ukrainians, because these were women and children and old people. Whereas in the case of all other migrants, we could always hear something like, these are young men escaping the country, and young men should not be escaping their country because they should be fighting for their country. So women, all right, elderly people, all right, children, all right, but not men, and not young men. So what can actually be done, and how can we work on the change in the attitude of this, like regarding that young men have completely different duties towards their country, and in the situation of crisis, danger, war, they should behave in a totally different way, and they should not be moving then, they should stay and they should fight.
Thank you. I say two things. Firstly, I think context is critical. So if you compare Ukrainian distress migration and Afghan distress migration, they're completely different contexts. In the Afghan situation, most of the people fleeing are men, not because they're not taking their responsibilities, but because they don't want to be forcibly recruited by the Taliban. And so it's very interesting to see in the US, where, along with Western Europe, you know, there was very hostile attitude towards Afghan refugees for decades. People could not get refugee status if you were Afghan. All of a sudden now, the attitude has changed, and all these young male Afghans are getting protection because people are aware that the alternative is, you know, what's to be part of the Taliban. So I think in some, that's my first point, in some contexts, there may be this sense, yes, you should be staying at home and fighting for, you know, for your country, but not in all contexts at all, you know, because if the context of fighting for is a tyrannical or a brutal government which suppresses rights and is engaged in crimes against humanity, arguably, amongst the Taliban, then I don't think kind of like the publics you're talking about would have that attitude. Secondly, I think that my point that government and leaders, political leaders, have an obligation to preempt need by being out there in a constructive way, I think that is so important. It's really not in my view, it's not the prerogative of local people to say, you should sacrifice yourself. If a local person wants to sacrifice themselves, fine, be a hero. But not everybody wants to be a hero. And I can understand that attitude amongst people, but that attitude often comes from opinion formers. It's not, you know, many of the people who are saying that at the same time would not want their own sons and husbands and fathers to die. So I think that it is part of the same dynamic of using all sorts of rhetorical devices to justify exclusion. I mean, I think the Polish-Ukrainian situation is really an important one for us to learn from. You know, to what extent is this going to change the way Poles think I don't know. I mean, you guys would know better, and maybe it's far too early to say. If tomorrow Afghans fleeing the Taliban, with all that we know about what's happening in Afghanistan, where it's the only country in the world where girls over the age, of puberty cannot go to school, what attitude would Polish public take now that they've had this experience? I don't know. Would they say, well, they're Muslims and they're not like us, or would they say, well, there is something that we've learned? I don't know. But anyway, it's a very important point you raise, yeah.
As a kind of a follow-up to what you've been saying about empathic solidarity and, transforming, yes, the notion of a community as expanding beyond us into this all-exclusive we. And I think what you've just said is absolutely crucial while analyzing what is happening in Poland, because we're talking about, the same, if we, even though I don't want to uphold the concept of race, but if we use this concept, the same racial community, that shares a lot of similar cultural background. So that question of transformation through empathic solidarity is so much easier. And I think it's a very important factor. And I'm thinking about so much resentment and also systemic resentment that, for example, a student of mine coming from Yemen encountered living in Poland and trying to get her visa extended. And she cannot even get a job as a teacher of English because the moment she wears her hijab, their parents, for example, are calling and, so she cannot get a job. But so I'm thinking that this is another, factor to consider while analyzing. And this is part of also I'm adding to what Anya has just said.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I'm just thinking also from what you said, how slow these processes are. I mean, all of you probably have followed this remarkable story about the lady in waiting to, Camilla, the wife of King Charles, who, went in for this racist diatribe against this black British leader of a women's rights organization in Hackney in London. And we've had black British people in England for as long as, I can remember. I mean, so these processes, that racism is so still ingrained. So for a country like Poland, where this is relatively new, of course, this is not going to happen overnight. And of course, it's going to be a process of rethinking what it is to be Polish. Does being Polish include wearing a hijab in some cases or not? At the moment, obviously, you'd have one answer, but who knows in 10 or 20 years? So I think these are processes that, of course, are incremental, but we can't sit by passively. I think what I'm trying to say with this piece is that, governments, leaders, politicians, people in the position of influence need to anticipate what is predictable. And that's what the EU did with Ukraine. It anticipated in record time what was predictable, that a country being bombed to smithereens would experience massive exodus, and that people leaving would have very significant needs. Not rocket science. It would have been the same for Syria, but it didn't happen. It would have been the same for Afghanistan, it didn't happen.
Hi, thank you so much for your very interesting presentation, and thank you that you emphasized the role of the local and frontline communities. I work and I support Roma refugees from Ukraine. I work with them, from the beginning of the war, and before the war, I also work with the Roma community here in Poland. And I have a lot of thoughts, and it's not new because I'm thinking, how to wake up people and how to show them that, empathetic solidarity is also towards people who are here. I'm talking about hundreds, thousands of Romani people who lived in Ukraine before the war. We have probably 70 or even more, 70,000 of Romani people from Ukraine, and they are completely excluded. I mean, the entire responsibilities was moved on us, as participants and representatives of the Roma community here in Poland. And we don't have tools which might be helpful in the context of, politicians, local authorities and societies. So I'm wondering how to wake up empathetic solidarity towards people whose image was very negative among majority societies before the war. It's really challenging and it's really frustrating because we have a very open hearts, but not for everybody.
No, thank you. I'm so glad you raised that point, and I actually should have mentioned this even in my comments. So I'm really thank you for raising this. This is 500-600 years of structural racism against Roma throughout Europe. I think it's an enormous challenge, an enormous responsibility on Europeans, all Europeans, to address this. Should not just be the responsibility of Roma activists like yourself. And I think that kind of coming to terms, in a way, I don't know if you agree, that in Europe, the only racism that is kind of okay in many right-thinking circles is anti-Roma racism. It's not okay in right-thinking circles, however we define them. It's not okay to be anti-black. Increasingly, it's not okay to be homophobic. But it's incredible how okay it is to be anti-Roma. So, again and again and again. So I think you make a very important point. I have no idea whether this experience of the war is going to change that. The signs, I suppose, so far are not great because, there was also the case with the students, the international students. The press documented racism. So this wasn't just a big open heart. You're absolutely right. And of course, it's, again, I think the point about leadership and about government anticipating needs. I mean, with Roma, the point is that there's been systemic racism throughout the social structure. So, whereas people criticize Roma parents for not being interested, apparently, in education, our evidence, and we've done some evidence in the center where I work, shows that Roma students are continuously exposed to bullying and harassment and racism in school, and so they withdraw. They're pushed out of school. It's not that the parents don't put the children in school. Those children are pushed out of school by persistent racism, and so I think you're absolutely right to raise that point, and it's a much bigger point than just the Ukrainian Roma. It's the whole continent really has this extraordinary legacy of hatred and racism. It is a form of structural racism which really permeates Europe. So I'm so glad you raised that. Thank you.
Our time is over, so Professor, on behalf of the Dean of the Faculty of Modern Languages and all the members of the faculty and all the guests of the Congress, thank you very much for your plenary lecture. And dear guests, dear participants, thank you very much for your questions and for fruitful discussion. I wish you a good time during the Congress, and now we have time for discussion during the coffee break. Thank you very much, Professor.